folks what we've heard about. We started with this whole, this idea of the moment, and we've sort of been hearing about specific impacts of this moment, from, community preparedness and firefighter well-being and all that. So this final session, we're going to talk more science-y this time, and this is going to be sort of a bigger look at sort of where we are and where we're headed. And so to help us do that, we have Steve Pine. Steve is a distinguished sustainability fellow in the Julianne Wrigley Global Futures Laboratory and an emeritus and regents professor in the School of Life Sciences at Arizona State University. He's published more than 40 books, and fortuitously, one of them is titled "The Pyrocene: How We Created an Age of Fire and What Happens Next." Mike Flanagan is a BC Innovation Research Chair in Predictive Services, Emergency Management, and Fire Science, as well as the Science Director of the Canadian Partnership for Wildland Fire Science, located at the University of Alberta. Mike's primary research interests include fire and weather, climate interactions, lightning-ignited forest fires, and landscape fire modeling. He was the editor-in-chief of the International Journal of Wildland Fire and has served in leadership roles with such efforts as the U.S. National Assessment on Global Change and the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. And last but certainly not least is Luke Montrose. Luke's an environmental toxicologist at Colorado State University. His research interests are in public health, epigenetics, and chronic illness, particularly as it relates to vulnerable and understudied populations. A primary focus of the Montrose Lab is studying the negative health impacts of wildfire smoke exposure among communities and workers, including wildland firefighters. In 2020, Luke launched the Rocky Mountain Wildfire Smoke Symposium, which involves participants from academia, government, and industry. So, there you have it. Steve, take it away.
Okay, thank you. Well, let me try to give you a big picture. At least on my screen, it blocks out the top between three fires. So what do I mean by that? Let me give you a very short, but I hope useful introduction to fire. Fire's been on the planet as long as plants have been on continents. We've got charcoal, 420 million years old. So fire and terrestrial life have co-evolved, fine. A big change occurs when one species acquires the ability to start and stop fire more or less at will. That's us. That is a huge shift. There used to be a bunch of species who could do that. Now there's only one. That's us. But all of those things occurred within the context of living landscapes, which is to say they came with all kinds of ecological checks and balances. There were baffles and barriers. There's always so much you can do. And people were very adept at making those barriers elastic, pushing, straining, rearranging them. But if you broke it, then the system fails and it becomes uninhabitable for you. So you learn not to do that. But we wanted more firepower, and that means more stuff to burn. So we looked to the geologic past to acquire that, and in effect started burning what I call lithic landscapes, that is once living, but now buried and lithified in the geologic record. And this is a change in quantity, and in some respects, a change in quality. It's a continuous story with humans using fire to do things on the landscape, either directly by burning or, more in the case of lithic landscapes, having machines to do it as intermediates. But in effect, we take the stuff out of the geologic past, layer it on the present, and leave most of its effluent for the future. And that's a big change from the fire story people had previously. It had always been a quest for fire had been a quest for sources, finding more stuff to burn and ways to burn it. But now the problem is sinks. there's no place to put all of the waste products and the effluent. So we're overloading the atmosphere, the oceans, land. There are no ecological checks and balances to these fires. You can burn day and night, winter and summer, wet or dry, it doesn't matter. So again, all of the old kinds of constraints and layered, webbed environment within which fire operated are gone. They only exist to the extent that we choose to put it. So we began what I think of as a Pyrrhic transition. I'm sorry I coined the term because it gets misused and misdefined and misunderstood, but it's my term for describing what happens when people begin shifting from living landscapes as a source of firepower to fossil landscapes. We completely remake our domestic environments in the developed world. Fire is banned from most settings, from most of our houses, our offices, many of our factories and the rest. We no longer have open working flames in buildings. And this in many ways has been a great asset. We don't have the fires that such ignitions, permanent sort of ignitions cause, and we don't have the smoke. But we extended that into cities. You know, our cities used to burn as often as the surrounding countryside. Well, they were made of the same materials, subject to the same winds and droughts. The classic case in U.S. history is 1871 when Chicago burned, but 1 million acres burned in the woods around it as well. The same system, the same sets of fuels and conditions applied to both. Well, in the developed urban world, we don't have that. They're all made out of different materials. Most of these materials have already, in a sense, passed through the fire to become glass or brick or cement. And they're arranged in such a ways that fire is very, very difficult. But we also extended that into the countryside with agriculture. Most agriculture was based on a rhythm of fire and water. And here's a sample from the 1870s in the Black Forest of Germany, for heaven's sakes. Fire was fundamental to certainly European land use, but it was embedded within an agricultural context. But fire was fundamental for a lot of hunting and foraging and so forth. But with the Green Revolution, we've made that transition now, although especially bred plants are a critical element. What you need are all the supplements. And where do the supplements come from? Well, they come from fossil biomass. They're petrochemicals, fertilizers, pesticides, herbicides, and the mechanisms for applying them. So you've eliminated fallow, which you needed as a part of the old agricultural system. You needed to leave the land for a period so that it could be burned, so that the old stuff could be burned. We don't need to do that, so we've eliminated fallow. But fallow was also where most of the biodiversity exists in an agricultural landscape. So another side effect was eliminating biodiversity. And perhaps more surprisingly, we extended that even to wildlands, nature reserves, and the rest. Here is how people had traditionally managed fire. They substituted their own fires for wildfires, or natural fires, or enemy fires, and they manipulated the landscape. And the interaction of all those over hundreds, in some cases thousands, in a few cases tens of thousands of years, created a landscape that was adapted to anthropogenic fire. But the same transition occurs. And we appeal essentially to machines and our other implements to remove those fires from all landscapes, just as we did in houses. And this had all kinds of negative consequences. But in effect, it was even possible because we had a counterfire from what I think of as a third fire, or industrial combustion, burning fossil fuels. So take away our helicopters and air tankers, take away our bulldozers and graders, take away our engines, water tanks, take away our chainsaws and pumps, and take away the vehicles that carry these crews and equipment in and out. Could we pretend to fight fire? No, of course not. So we're seeing the limits to this. And in fact, the limits, the ecological limits and the problems of fuel building up were already apparent 50 years ago. And so between 68 and 78, the federal agencies in the US reformed policy from a suppression only approach to one that would seek a more pluralistic relationship to fire and would seek to restore a good fire, getting fire back onto the land for various reasons. And I'll note that all this occurs before climate change is an issue. And the competition that occurs between this sort of fires from lithic landscapes and fires in living takes place at individual sites. You have one or the other. But as we've liberated all these greenhouse gases from this binge burning of fossil fuels, it's now globalized the issue. It's acting as a performance enhancer, and it's bringing accelerated fire conditions to places that didn't make the transition on their own. So the big history: for 420 million years, fire existed on the planet. It was patchy in space and time. It was always there, but not always at every place or at every place in the same way. People changed this hugely. They effectively recode all the patches and pulses that had guided the ecology of fire and expand the domain of fire on a huge scale. And then we come to what I think of as the third fire with our lithic landscapes. You can see I'm no graphic artist, but I'm trying to indicate that we're taking stuff out of the geologic past, a different dimension, processing it in the present, and then releasing its effluents to the geologic future. Okay, and as you make that transition, the world, as I say, in individual places tends to go one or the other. These are satellite images of the Earth at night. It's a particularly useful one. Europe, a developed continent, sub-Saharan Africa, still burning large expanses of the living landscapes. Now, not all of those electric lights in Europe are the result of combustion power. France has got nuclear, there's hydro, but these are essentially societies that have been shaped by it. And one of the things that gets lost is that you don't see a middle ground between those two. And that's what's happened historically, that range of anthropogenic fire, historic use of fire by humans, has disappeared. And a lot of what strategists are thinking about now is finding ways to reintroduce it. And one of the interesting dimensions to this is the recovery of traditional knowledge. And for the most part in the US and Canada, this has been defined as indigenous knowledge, which it is, but there's also a whole bunch of traditional knowledge from Europe and American settlement that was also lost. European elites treated Finnish slash and burners and Greek pastoral burners with the same disdain they did indigenous peoples in Africa or India. And we're also left with a number of paradoxes, one of which is that the megafires that we've seen over the last 20, 25 years are really a pathology of the developed world. The developing world uses fire for land clearing, converting forest, peatlands, and so forth. But the megafire as a wildfire, moving in and impacting communities and so forth that we've seen that get so much attention, is really a phenomenon of the developed world. And this should give us pause. Why those countries that are the wealthiest, the most scientifically endowed, have the densest technology, and the greatest firepower are the ones that have created this paradox. So this is a Currier and Ives print I like, from the mid 19th century US. And there it is, propelling the country settlement across the continent. But it also, interestingly, divides the world into burned and unburned. How intentional that was, I don't know from the artist, but that's a pretty good account of how the world is dividing. And we can see this in many, many forms. You have one or the other. This is one of my favorite images. This was a 2003 fire north of Tucson. That's Biosphere 2. So a completely designed, self-contained, completely recycled world that could be plopped down on Mars, if you wish, but has absolutely no place for fire. Partly a scale and partly because of its character and its primitive connotations, perhaps. In the background, the Santa Catalina Mountains, a full-throated wildfire, which is both essential and inevitable. And what we struggle with is finding a middle ground. We lost that middle ground when we made this transition. We don't have a middle ground of art. We don't have a middle ground of narratives. We don't have a middle ground of imagery. Another favorite, this is the Alaska pipeline with a nice boreal fire, backfire being set against it. And two quick examples of this. These are, excuse me, NASA hotspot images of fires in the U.S. The yellow are wildfires. The red are continuing agricultural burns for one kind or another. And this is burned area. But if you look at CO2 emissions, this is the map you get, and you have one or the other. And as you burrow down or get into finer scales, you see that this difference retains. What we've done, however, particularly with greenhouse gases, is generalize the overall conditions and make it more hostile or more favorable to fire. An extreme example of this is the two Koreas. Here, South Korea has made the transition to modernity and modern energy sources, etc. North Korea, conspicuous by the absence. But if you look at hotspots, satellite imaging hotspots for North Korea, you see that they're all in that political entity, that you have one or the other. And it shows the power of humans in this case to change what would seem to be beyond our capabilities. And now South Korea, having replanted the forests that were lost during the war and converted to a modern economy, finds that it has the same kinds of fires as other developed countries and is now fighting it by the same kinds of methods. All right, larger sense, where's all this going? When you add up all the things that people are doing with fire and have done for a long time, we're creating a different world from the Pleistocene, which prevailed for the last 2.5 million years, series of ice ages, conspicuous by ice-informed landscapes, but all kinds of collateral landscapes, lakes, permafrost, various kinds of pattern ground, drops in sea level, and mass extinctions, as well as biogeographic shifts. And here are the hominins, the first creatures to begin manipulating fire, and here are erectines doing what hominins do, bringing fuel to the fire. But let's pass that through this kind of Pyrrhic prism, and what we get today is what had been an interglacial, I think is becoming its own epoch, a fire age. And this is being driven by anthropogenic fires. And fire now is driving out ice everywhere at ever escalating rates. And we have changes in sea level. Mass extinctions. These arrows are just figurative. They're not exact. And lots of what we might call peripyric or collateral landscapes influenced by fire. Maybe instead of outwash plains, we have debris flows from post-fire erosion. Or we have giant smoke palls replacing list plains and sand plains. Instead of proglacial lakes, maybe heat domes, almost all of which eventually become fire domes. Instead of permafrost, we have a permathaw. We have radical shifts in biogeography, overturning of landscapes. Very few are likely to come back to what they were before because the climate and other conditions will have changed. And what about the hominins? Well, here we are in Fort McMurray in Canada. Fort McMurray, a city, a first world city built to mine tar sands, a particularly dirty fossil fuel, powered by that and created a representative of that kind of society, but plucked in the middle of a boreal bush which will catch fire. And here it is, taking out a large part of the town and sending hominids not reaching for more fire, but fleeing it. And of course, fleeing it in their petrol-powered cars. Although I will say, being Canadian, they did it without any road rage or unwelcome incidents. So add it all up, and welcome to the Pyrocene. Now I think it's maturing, and I see no evidence of it backing down. So, oops. Oh, I think I screwed up my slides. Anyway, so why do we have these fires? What are the conditions in places in the first world? We've created a kind of third fire nature. Look at the way we have organized our landscapes, how we organize agriculture, how we build cities, where we build cities, how we arrange fuels, if you will. All kinds of ecological pathologies, including climate change, and fire integrates all of these. Fire takes its character from its context. And this is, if you create this kind of context, this is the kind of fire you get. And if we substitute renewables for fossil fuels as a primary energy source, but we otherwise live the same way, we're going to have the same kinds of fire problems we have now. We may remove the amplification from climate change, but we created all these problems and began reforming policies before climate change was even a scientific issue. So it's no longer really about living with fire. I think we've gotten beyond that, or relearning to live with fire. It's about living with a fire age. And I think we continue to underappreciate the extent with which humans and fire have remade our world. And we think of fire as an episodic thing or a seasonal thing, or we have this crazy year in Canada or a crazy year in Australia, without realizing this is a global reformation. We are remaking the Earth into an even more fire-friendly planet than it was. And frankly, as a fire historian, I will make this claim that climate history has now become a sub-narrative of fire history. So what about the future? Often reminded of the Old Testament prophet Ezekiel, who declaimed they shall go out from one fire and another fire shall devour them. And that seems like a pretty good prophecy, except it's actually worse, because we're not passing or dealing with two fires, we're having to deal with three, which makes it a three-body problem and infinitely more complex. But you know, we are the fire creature. We are the keystone species for fire on the planet. Fire is what we do in the great chain of being. So this is within our capacity to fix. We created it and we can fix it. We took our best friend and made it our worst enemy. We took what was a mutual assistance pact and turned it into a Faustian bargain. And good fire made us, bad fire may break us, but you know that choice is ours. So with that, I'm sorry if I sounded a little harassed. I wasn't sure I was going to make it here on time. So let me shut. Okay.
All right. Thanks, Steve. Appreciate that. You know, the discussion of the fire age and your mention of Canada is a nice segue, actually, to Mike. Mike, being Canadian, Mike is now going to tell us a little more about dial us down to North America and talk about what just happened here between Canada and the United States, and et cetera. Mike, go ahead.
Thanks. Yes, it was Canada's turn to have extreme fire year. And this picture was taken a couple of years ago during the 2021 heat event in Canada. I live in Kamloops, and I have a sister in Tucson. Kamloops in 2021 was hotter than any temperature Tucson has ever seen, which is just kind of mind-boggling to me. That's a picture of what we call a pyro-CB, pyrocumulonimbus. And it looks angry, and it was. It started 40 new fires in yeah, it's just a beast. So there's indirect impacts fire, and that's the Coquihalla Highway there on the left. The smoke in the valleys, that's where people live. And on the right, that we had an atmospheric river rate event in 2021, and many of those burned areas along the Coquihalla Highway washed out and took the highway out. And interior BC could not get to the coast, at least through Canada. We had to go through the States. Canada, we have 6,000 fires, burn about 2.8 million hectares. That's about the size of Massachusetts for context. These are often high intensity, high severity fires. Area burns highly variable, and a factor of 70 from the quietest year to the busiest year. And unlike the States, it's almost 50-50 for fires started by people versus fires started by lightning. Lightning does burn most of the area burned though, but fire is all about the extremes. 3% of the fires are greater than 200 hectares. Hectares about the size of a soccer pitch, but they represent 97% of the area burned. And these spread days, hot, dry, windy days, the extreme weather really drives the fire business. So, when we talk about the variability from year to year, there's a graph of BC, and you can see that in the last 7 years, we burned more than the previous 58 years. And it's because we're seeing more extreme fire weather. And the difference between the quietest year and the busiest year in British Columbia is like a factor of 1,000. And it's because of extreme fire weather. The graph shows the human-caused fires dominate in our spring, and lightning dominates in our summer. And this just shows a map that it goes from sea to sea in Canada. There are some areas with less fire, but we're a fire-dominated landscape. Canada is different than the States, okay, in many respects, including fire and fire management. We have large swaths of flammable forest, i.e. the boreal forest, and it extends into Alaska and Siberia, where they survive and thrive in a regime of semi-regular, high-intensity, stand-renewing, stand-replacing wildfires. But many of these fires are not suppressed. They are monitored, okay, and allowed to burn. Let Mother Nature do her thing. And they do. And, which causes, those indirect impacts from smoke. So Canadian fire management agencies are among the best in the world. We use something called the Canadian Forest Fire Danger Rating System, and modern countries have their own version. The US has one, Australia has one, Europe has one, though the Canadian Fire Weather Index system is kind of the de facto standard for at least fire weather. Fire management is challenging, and it's going to get more challenging as we have more development on the landscape, more expectations, and of course, our changing climate. In Canada, we spend $1 billion a year, though that's been increasing more rapidly than our area burned, which has doubled since the 70s. More disasters. It's quite a lengthy definition of what a disaster is for this database, the Canadian Disaster Database, but these are mostly evacuations. And I would argue we are reaching our limit of traditional fire suppression or fire management. Smoke, I'm not sure if you can see my cursor, but the gray stuff, that's smoke. So California, Oregon, Washington, it can travel long distances. And apparently old smoke is more toxic than fresh smoke, though there generally is less old smoke than the new smoke. But the thing is, if you're downtown New York, the likelihood of your place burning down is essentially zero. But the quality of life can be in the tank for a couple of weeks because of smoke from a fire 1,000 kilometers away. And we saw this in 2023. The eastern seaboard was smoked out and impacted the quality of life for millions of people. So if you've ever seen me talk, you see me present this slide, all right? Because there's a recipe for wildfire. It's a simple recipe and it applies to Australia, the Amazon, or Canada, all right? 3 ingredients: vegetation. Fire people love to call it fuel. What type, how much, how dry, all important aspects. Ignition, people, and lightning. I said Canada's 50-50, but globally, it's probably 99% are human caused. Weather, these are the extreme days, the spread days, the hot, dry, windy days. And that bottom right picture is taken near the 60-degree north latitude, and it's November, and this is a peat fire that burns through winters. So let's talk about 2023, okay? Uncharted territory. It has no comparison. I've been watching fire actively since the late 70s in Canada, and I'm completely caught off guard by this year. Somebody would have told me 10 million hectares. Yeah, maybe. 16 to 18 million? No. Evacuations, significant evacuations, emissions. There's a number of estimates out there, but at the minimum, it's equal to Canada's fossil fuel emissions as a society. Expenditures, yeah, average 1 billion. BC alone is spending 1 billion. And we hear this a lot, that and I dealt with the media a lot this year, and some of them media was saying, oh, there was more fire in the past, and that part is true, but they would say that this was an average year in the past, and that's complete bullshit. Okay, because this is an exceptional year in any time period, because over 4% of our forests burned. We would not have forests if we had 4% burn every year. If that was an average year, our forests would disappear. Fire wouldn't disappear, because what would replace the forest? Shrubs or grassland. And grasslands can burn every year or twice a year. So fire wouldn't go away. But in terms of forest fires, and that's what we're dealing with in Canada, this is an exceptional year. And yeah, this slide's from July or whatever, but I just wanted to show you, it was unusual in terms of how broad the fire is spread across Canada. Typically we have it, in the west, sometimes in the central, sometimes the east, but not the whole country at that same time. And yeah, there was a few breaks in there. And as I say, I've been watching fire for over 40 years. I saw this in 2021 for a few days, but this lasted for a few weeks where the whole country was on fire. Just extraordinary. So, uncharted territory, geographic coverage, record-breaking temperatures, drought, atmospheric blocking, early start. There's work out suggesting that what we saw in 2023 in Canada is equivalent to a 2050s medium-based scenario. If this is what 2050s look like, we're in trouble, okay? And, I'm going to talk a bit about temperature in relationship to fire, and it's important, okay? And as we continue to warm, 2023 is going to be the warmest year on record. It's a lock. Whether it exceeds 1.5, we'll have to wait and see, but it's within the realm of possibility. And of course, COP's going on right now. It's becoming even more political than it was in the past. The bottom line here is that, we've been doing a pretty good job, forecasting increases in temperature. Not a great job forecasting the impacts of the temperature increases. And if we meet our commitments, we're supposed to be near that blue line, maybe just under the darker blue line, under 3 degrees Celsius. But our track record of meeting commitments is abysmal. Okay, so if that's our best case scenario, we're in real trouble unless we make some changes. In terms of fire, we expect more extreme weather, so we expect more fire. So why is temperature so important? And here I'm not talking about individual fire like the Fort Murray fire we saw pictures from, or the Lytton fire, or the Camp Fire, or the Maui fire. We're talking about a larger area like California or British Columbia over a longer period of time, like decades. So a warmer world means longer fire seasons. And we're seeing that. California talks about a fire year. We're not far off. There was a fire yesterday in Alberta, caused evacuations. It's December, and we're seeing this more and more. more lightning. And for Canadians, that's a big problem because our human-caused fires are actually decreasing. Area burned from human-caused fires are decreasing due to things like fire bans and education, but lightning has more than compensated for it. But probably the most important reason is as the atmosphere warms, the ability to suck moisture out of fuel, and here I'm talking about dead fuels in the forest floor, needles, leaves, cured grass, increases almost exponentially. So unless we see increasing precipitation to compensate for this drying effect from the warming, we're going to see drier fuels. And all our models of the future, at least for Canada, suggest that's not the case. As a matter of fact, many areas are going to see less precipitation. So it looks like our fuels are going to get drier. And this is a critical piece to understanding fire. The drier the fuel, the easier it is for fire to start, easier it is for fire to spread. And it means more fuel is available to burn, which leads to higher intensity fires that are difficult to impossible to extinguish. You know, the public has this misconception, I think, that we can put out all the fires all the time. And that's just not the case. If a fire occurs and the fuels are dry, and it's one of those hot, dry, windy days, and the fire gets larger than a hectare, we can't put it out. We can post pretty pictures of planes dropping retardant, but it's like spitting on a campfire. We're not putting that fire out. All right. So I'm going to wrap up here. More extreme fire weather in the future, at least regionally across the globe. And our fire management has to adapt to this new reality. Some people like to say new normal. I don't like that term because it sounds like it's a steady state or a plateau. We're on a trajectory. We're on Dante's circle of hell. We're third circle, fourth cycle. I don't know, but we're going that direction. And we may be entering new territory without historical analogs. And that's a bit scary. High intensity fires occurring outside our normal time period, occurring in areas where we've never seen them before. Fire and site interactions will increase in the future. And yeah, we're going to have more impacts. And yeah, people won't like this, but we have to learn to live, coexist with fire and smoke. We will see more high intensity fires. This year was a record-breaking year. Canada, we're numbering about 140 fire-generated thunderstorms. The global record was 2021 at 100 and 102. So these our danger rating systems really don't model these very well at all. Okay? We're seeing more wildfires burn through the night. This was taken at 4 a.m., not too far from where I live. Yeah, we're going to see more of these. Fire is a multifaceted issue. We'll need multi-pronged approaches. There is no silver bullet here. Drones aren't going to make this problem go away. AI, machine learning, is a tool. These tools will help. But the bottom line is, as long as there's vegetation and ignition agent and appropriate weather, we will see fire. And because of a climate change and warming world, we're going to see a lot more fire. And I'll stop there. Thank you.
All right. Thanks, Mike. You may have outdone the insurance session for just sheer volume of terror. Thank you. So now we're going to turn it over to Luke. And Luke's going to tell us about the health impacts of all that. So thanks again, Mike, and Luke, take it away. You might be muted.
All right. Which screen do you guys see? When I do the
we can see the whole rack of slides right now.
How about now?
There we go.
Excellent.
Great.
All right. So I guess thinking about what we've already learned and thinking about health, I want to identify a few main key concepts, and then I'm going to zip through these slides and then hopefully have a nice discussion at the end. But the concepts that I want to bring up are, given the given what we've heard, what are the long-term impacts? What are the cumulative impacts? And what systemic impacts? And I'm talking about systemic body impacts. So from a hominid-centric thinking about ourselves, what is this going to do to us? Is it just our lungs, or is it more than that? This slide's just to let you know that none of this gets done in a vacuum. I'm an environmental toxicologist, but it takes a village, social scientists, epidemiologists, and lots of new students coming into this world. Also, my lab does field and lab work, and I'll talk a little bit more about that in a second, but kind of a unique lab in that respect. We've already got a really nice setup to this idea that there's a new fire landscape among us, and where there's fire, there's smoke. And so here, there's two really great papers, this McClure paper from 2018 and a more recent Nature paper by Burke in 2023. Both of these tell a similar story, which is for the Western region, as opposed to the Eastern region that's getting better, air quality is getting better. Our Western region air quality is getting worse. And these dog legs that you can see across these different regions kind of happen around 2017. That's where air quality either, if it was getting better in the West, it stopped getting better, or it got worse. And 2017, 2020 are in the top 5 for worst wildfires in the last 60 years. And all of this leads to this conclusion that while we've been concerned with urban air pollution for the last few decades, if you were to put all sources of air pollution in one hand and wildfire smoke pollution in the other hand, we're getting to a point where those are going to be balanced out. Apologies for this thing doing its own thing. Let me fix this real quick. Okay. It has a mind of its own. So what's in smoke, and why are we concerned with it? Hundreds, if not thousands, of chemical constituents. These are the main players that we worry about. You see nasties here like acrolein, formaldehyde, things that you would think of as being in cigarette smoke. We see that here. Also PM 2.5 and other various size fractions of particulate matter. And the PM 2.5 is what we use as a proxy for understanding the impact to human health. It's something that we can measure. It's also something that we know a little bit about as far as it getting down into the deepest parts of our lung. This is just to show you that these particles are smaller than a human hair. PM 2.5 is very much smaller than a human hair. These can occlude the ability of oxygen exchange. We breathe in oxygen, it goes across our lung-blood barrier, very important, and blocking of that is problematic. It's already been mentioned that different things can burn. This has an impact on toxicology. What's burning matters. The temperature and the meteorologic conditions around that burn also matter. Just as an example, if you compare smoldering smoke to flaming smoke, you get huge differences in the amount of particulate produced as well as the type of gases produced, with smoldering smoke producing less gas and more particulate, flaming smoke producing more gas and less particulate. This was already mentioned, but to put some data to this idea that aged smoke or transient smoke may be more toxic on a one particle to one particle basis. Aged smoke is actually more reactive or has more oxidative potential. But as was mentioned, it also is diluted over time. So it's still remains to be seen how important this factor is. So what does our body do with smoke? We do have natural defense mechanisms. We can scrub out some particles with the structure of our nose through deposition, and then the removal via the mucociliary escalator in our upper respiratory tract. We can remove particles. And then for those really small particles that get deep into the lung, we have these little Pac-Men, these cells called macrophages in our lung that are residents there. They're immune cells. Their job is to seek and destroy foreign invaders. And if you get exposed to a small amount of smoke, your body's very good at dealing with that and getting rid of it. It's when you overwhelm all three of these mechanisms that you lend yourself to these acute and chronic issues. So things like emergency room visits go up when you have a wildfire, things like COPD exacerbations, bronchitis, and you can even have immune system suppression. I've seen a couple of recent papers come out that showed that following the years of the worst wildfires in Montana, they had the worst flu seasons. We saw in California, following a wildfire season, they had some of the worst COVID-19 responses. So you also then, if you extend the window of exposure, now you start getting into chronic conditions like cardiovascular disease, stroke, cancer. And I'm going to introduce this idea of both impacts to the brain and reproductive tract. But everyone's not created equal in this situation, although we can all be impacted. The young, the old, the pregnant, those with comorbidities, and particularly those who have to work in the smoke and can't get away from it. Those outdoor workers are particularly vulnerable. And being at CSU, I'll also just throw in that this is a One Health problem. Smoke also impacts livestock and domestic animals. If not to the same extent, it definitely impacts them. So why can't we just say everything that we've learned in the last few decades about urban or traffic-related air pollution, we'll just apply that to wildfire smoke? Well, it turns out they're chemically different. They're also different in magnitude and temporality. And I just kind of created this little hypothetical for you all to consider. The yellow bars represent the type of exposure you might see if you were in a community setting, like let's say Los Angeles, being exposed to community air pollution. That community air pollution may be relatively high. 20 is over the, both the CDC and the World Health Organization and the EPA's, annual guidelines. But if you look at this, it's relatively consistent. If you look at the blue bars, we see that there's a couple different events that happen throughout the year. Let's say that you were in Idaho, northern Idaho. So you start off the year with a winter inversion. Right around April, the local fire department starts prescribed burning. So you get another uptick. Come into September, you get a pretty bad wildfire season. You're getting exposed there. And then at the end of that, they allow them to do ag burning. So you've been exposed to all of these, tremendously high events, but with relatively low exposure in the meantime. And so my question to you is, what's the average exposure across the year? Because let's assume that that's our first starting point for trying to understand this exposure. Well, it turns out that the average of both of these in this hypothetical are both around 15 micrograms per meter cubed. Okay, so what does that mean? Would we expect that these two different dynamics have the same health outcomes? My answer to you is we really have no idea. We haven't got our arms wrapped around this yet. We're not even to the point where we're trying to study this. We're just beginning to understand how to talk about this. And that's, I think, what I want to talk about now is where do we go next? We need to come up with a common language so that we can discuss these types of exposures. So within one wildfire season, you might have acute, subchronic, chronic exposures. Those might be repetitive. You might have multiple exposures across the fire season, and you might think about cumulative effects. Should we also be thinking about long-term episodic exposure? So from year over year, being in a community where you're exposed 3 or 4 times to these week-long exposures, what does that look like? What about crossover exposures? Someone who comes from a very polluted urban environment and then moves to a fire landscape like in the West. Are those people at more or less risk? And what about novel exposures? So those folks who don't typically deal with fire or smoke, but are exposed to things like the Canadian wildfires. Should we be more or less concerned about those folks? These are all very difficult challenges to address. So then from a toxicologist standpoint, we need to have this common language so then I can adapt this to the types of animal models that I'm looking at so that I can consider regiment, population. Obviously, community and occupational exposures are going to be different. The distance, the fire conditions, and the source. So my last question to you at the title slide was: are wildfire smoke effects confined to the lung and the heart? And here's just a quick run through of why, what our motivation is for studying these systemic effects. We know that after a smoke exposure, we can measure these proteins in the circulating blood that indicate inflammation. So these cytokines like IL-8. And Because these are able to be measured out in the blood, we sort of contextualize this as being a spillover effect. And if these inflammatory cytokines reach the bloodstream, they have access to every tissue and every organ in the body. And knowing that kind of makes this slide make sense. This recent ramp up, this is just a selection that I've put together. It's definitely not exhaustive, that this selection of extrapulmonary effects that we're seeing in the literature, things like dementia, preterm birth, sperm quality, small for gestational age, differences in immunity, metabolism, and milk production in cattle, and miscarriage rates among female firefighters. All of these things sort of lend themselves epidemiologically to an underlying mechanism whereby wildfire smoke impacts the lung, but then has other impacts across the body. So just a quick run through of what my lab does to maybe spark some other additional discussion. We use a cell to society approach, studying things from biomarkers and mechanisms of smoke effects to all the way out into field work, like studying indoor air quality assessments and trying to communicate risk. And then I've also, as was mentioned, created the Rocky Mountain Wildfire Smoke Symposium, which is a platform for data dissemination. Here's some examples of the studies that students in my lab are working on, using high throughput models to assess reproductive tox, using cows as canaries or cows as sentinels to understand reproductive effects, looking at different sources of smoke in cell models to understand if there's toxic differences between the different types of things that can burn, using omics approaches, so using epigenomics and other types of large data sets to understand what might be happening when you're exposed to smoke, and then piloting some wildland firefighter reproductive exposures, and then even using some ArcGIS or some mapping data, which I'll talk about in just a second. We've studied mice and smoke exposure. I kind of alluded to that a little bit. We exposed them to Douglas fir needles, and we showed that there's sperm effects. So this was one of the first things that drove our lab into looking at extrapulmonary effects, was showing that mice exposed to smoke have differences in sperm. Essentially, the information that the sperm was carrying was changed. I guess on the last slide there, the next steps for us is to understand if this is persistent and biologically impactful. Just because the information's changed doesn't necessarily mean that the sperm's bad, doesn't necessarily mean that the offspring will be impacted. So we need to figure that out. At the same time, though, we're using that last study to try to motivate studying this in firefighters to understand if the information that sperm carry in firefighters is also changed. We use this at-home kit that actually Bluetooths to your phone. The firefighter collects the sample in the privacy of their own house, and then the information is Bluetooth to their phone and they get a score. This allows us to do things remotely with large groups of firefighters without them all having to come into our lab. We've studied wildfire smoke intrusion into skilled nursing facilities as a location where there's vulnerable individuals. We showed that on a day where wildfire smoke got really bad outside this facility, the blue is the outdoor air quality. So you see spikes upwards of 120 micrograms per meter cubed. That same day inside, the air quality was 100 micrograms per meter cubed. So just barely better to be inside than outside. Some of these folks have COPD, asthma, maybe immobile. These are not folks that we need to be exposing to smoke. And so what can we be doing about that? And that's part of the efforts going on in our lab right now. This is preliminary data suggesting that if you were to do something, if you were to want to make a change in a facility, you'd need good data. So where is good data across the Mountain West? Well, it turns out that 220 out of 770 skilled nursing facilities across the Mountain West do not have representative air quality data from a regulatory monitoring site. This is something that authorities could help change as they try to figure out where to put new monitors, but this also should motivate skilled nursing facilities and other places that house vulnerable populations to take matters into their own hands and purchase new low-cost monitors that they can place inside and outside their facility. We've began piloting that. We put monitors in 4 facilities in Idaho. We're currently testing out this dashboard. This was recently publicized by Rachel Cohen at Boise State Public Radio. So thank you to her for doing that. The last couple of things I'll say here is, we're moving the field forward, trying to, with the platform for dissemination of data with the Rocky Mountain Wildfire Smoke Symposium, started in 2020, 3 years virtual, but this year was our first in-person meeting in Aurora, Colorado. Look out for this meeting info coming out soon. We hope to have another meeting in November 2024 in Missoula, Montana. We just published a book chapter, Wildfire Smoke Toxicology and Health. This is something that you could look into if you want to learn more about this with colleagues Chris Malaccio from the University of Montana, my postdoc Adam Schuler, and another great colleague, Savannah Devlin, who just recently moved from the University of Washington to Colorado Department of Public Health and Environment. I always like to end with solutions-oriented endings. I'll zip through this because you guys all know this, but essentially there are things that people can do to protect themselves. We breathe 9 out of 10 breaths of inside air. So if you protect the inside air, whether that's in your house, car, work, whatever, you can do yourself a favor that way. As long as your face doesn't look like mine, you can wear an N95 mask and avoid burning things or cooking things or cleaning things that produce indoor air pollution, and utilize these great tools that we now have, whether that be online databases or self-monitoring applications. With that, I'll take any questions. I hope to have a great dialogue with you all now that we have heard from a couple great speakers.
All right. Thanks, Luke. Thank you all. And looks like Eric is right out of the box, and here they come. So Eric, go ahead.
Hi, Luke. Thanks a lot. Been following this issue. We got smoked out, as you said, on the East Coast, and I can see effects on vulnerable populations. I'm wondering, this adage about the dose makes the poison, and given what we know about wildfires and how long they last, are you able to understand, longer term effects and whether they kind of stick with people, even if the wildfire may be gone in, a couple of days or week or so? So I'm kind of wondering about this. I imagine there are differences in people in an urban area. In the Bay Area, we saw this horrible thing a couple of years ago. People in New York City and East Coast already have urban loads of toxics that they're dealing with, freeways and so forth. But I'm wondering if you could talk about that sort of temporary nature of wildfires and how that affects our health long term.
One of the biggest limitations to studying long-term health effects is the incentive system for research is all based around grants. And grants typically have fairly short windows, and no one wants to fund an extended grant. So 3 years, maybe 5 years is what you get for a grant. And out of that 5 years, you may only do 2 years of research. The longest term study that I've seen anyone do is Chris Malaccio, University of Montana. He looked at Seeley Lake after they were inundated with smoke for, I think it was like 40 days. They had essentially Beijing quality air that was caused by a wildfire that was like right next door to Seeley Lake. Most of the residents, although encouraged to evacuate, did not. The first year that he went, he evaluated their respiratory health. They had slight declines, but it was negligible. It wasn't statistically significant. The following 2 years, though, they showed huge decrements in respiratory health. He wanted to go back, but COVID happened. So I think that fire happened in 2017. So he has data from 17, 18, 19, and then he didn't get to go back in 2020. So that's one of the longest term studies that I've seen. And we see these decrements in respiratory health. Past that, I can point you to the 2008 Camp Fire where California primates were exposed outdoors. And we've seen that the primates that were directly exposed continue to have impacts, but more important to me is the offspring of those primates that were exposed still have impacts, and some of them are extrapulmonary. So some of them still have behavioral issues, even though they weren't directly exposed to the smoke. They're just progeny of parents that were exposed to smoke now, several years ago. So I don't have a good answer, but that kind of shows you where
Thank
we're
you.
at. We're just beginning to think about this.
Thanks a lot. I appreciate it.
All right, thanks, Luke. Kat has a question. Kat Chang.
Hey, thanks all. Yeah, I have two questions for Mike, actually. I'm based in Toronto. But so over the summer, I'm wondering, we heard a lot of promises from officials, kind of promising to review and reflect on what happened. So I'm wondering, how would you describe the pulse of conversations that you hear right now that's taking place over the winter to prepare for next summer? And secondly, you mentioned we're seeing fire in a lot of new ecosystems that we're not used to. So I'm wondering, are there any particular ones that are red flags to you? So I'm thinking of potentially peatlands or maybe places with abandoned mines. Yeah.
Okay. I'll start with the last question first. There's always been peat fires, but as the warming and drying continues, we're seeing a lot more peat fires. And this raises another issue in that there's a lot of carbon stored in peat, as well as hydrates in the permafrost, whether it's terrestrial or seabed. And as we see more and more permafrost thawing and more peat burning, it's enough that, I argue the warmer the world, the more fire we see, especially with peatlands, the more greenhouse gases we see, which could, scientifically, the arguments, is the jury's still out. Does fire cause a global warming or a global cooling, or is it insignificant? I lean towards the warming because of peatlands and things like that. 2024, okay, it looks like it has a potential to be another bad year, another bad start with El Nino. It's where much of the country is in a drought, and typically El Nino means warm, dry springs in Canada. Fort McMurray 2016 was an El Nino year, a major El Nino. There is funding for fire, more than I've seen in my whole career, which is great to see, but it's basically status quo for next year is what I can tell you, Kat. That nothing has really changed. Fire management is the responsibility of the landowners for Americans on the call here. So that's 10 provinces, 2 of the 3 territories do it. We have 1 federal agency, Parks Canada, also fights fire. And they have some commonalities, but each of them does things a little bit differently as well. So hopefully that helps answer your question.
Makes sense. Maybe just a quick follow-up, because I know there was also talk about potentially creating like a federal or like national system. So I'm wondering your thoughts on this, because I think I've heard of like not everyone is, I guess, united behind the idea.
So I was at a parliamentary committee, which is a couple of weeks ago, on this very topic with respect to the Canadian Armed Forces. And it does make some sense to have a national activity, because we didn't have enough resources this year. And even though the Americans had a very quiet year and helped out a great deal, we had help from 13 countries around the world. There wasn't enough resources, okay? And the system of sharing resources, it's kind of a game, because, provinces, there's an agency that helps facilitate sharing resources. But if you're Quebec, for example, and Alberta asks for help, you want to help them, but you have to hold some back for your own province. And that's exactly what happened this year. They sent some people to Alberta, and it's about a 20-day commitment, because that's part of the term and the travel and time off. And then Quebec caught in fire, and they were short-staffed because they sent resources. If you had a national agency, you don't have to worry about it. You have a national fleet. It makes a lot of sense. and every dollar we spend kind of in prevention mitigation saves money down the road. So it does make sense. Are fire management agencies ready for it? I'd say no. It have to be hand in glove because it's a provincial responsibility. Blame it on Confederation. That's our problem. Thanks.
All right, thanks, Mike. Ashley has a question.
Yeah, thank you to everyone who presented. My question's for Luke. I've been really interested in this intersection of smoke and reproductive systems for a while, so the mouse study was really fascinating. So I'm curious to hear if your lab has produced any insights or specific findings about how smoke affects pregnant people. The primate study you mentioned is actually one that I keep getting referred to, which if that's the only one out there, that's great. But I'm just wondering if there's anything else out there.
So a really great researcher, Sarah Jenke, she's been doing some great work funded by FEMA to look at female wildland firefighter health effects in response to their smoke exposure. They just did a survey, which you should always be skeptical of self-report survey data. But they did find, and this was one of the things that I highlighted on that sort of growing epidemiologic literature page. They did find that miscarriage rates were, I think, twice the normal average. Small for gestational age, I believe, was another outcome that was about twice the risk. And there might have been, I can't remember what the other different metrics that they looked at, but Sarah Jenke's research is one place that you should definitely look at. They study wildland firefighters just because of the magnitude of exposure, but there's not very many female wildland firefighters, talking about like maybe 5% of the overall force. And so is that a good representation? The number of people that she had in her study, I think that remains to be seen, but that has created some momentum in the field, that FEMA funded study. And I'm hearing that there's more funding or more priority is being placed on both female and male reproduction in response to smoke exposure. My lab primarily focuses on the male side of things, and that's mostly because it's easier to study smoke-induced impacts on males than it is females when you're thinking about the germ cell. Because in males, the germ cells reproduce or regenerate every 70 days, whereas female oocytes, you get them when you're being formed as a human, and those oocytes are with you your entire life. So it's very difficult to pinpoint what one exposure did to that oocyte when it's really accumulation of all your toxic exposures over your entire life from the point that you were conceived. So that's why we study males, not because we think they're more important.
Thank you. I really appreciate that.
All right, thanks, Luke. Bethany threatens to ask a whole lot of questions, but maybe Bethany, you could pick a highlight question and then follow up later with Luke if you have a series of other questions.
I will restrain myself. Yes, thank you. So yes, my question is for Luke, and it's actually, so I am a science journalist now, but my PhD is in pharmacology, and I was wondering how the methylation patterns that you saw in sperm, I'm presuming that was a mouse study because you're now doing the human study. I was wondering how those methylation patterns that you saw in response to wildfire smoke compare to methylation patterns seen in sperm following nicotine exposure.
So that's a really great question. I'll have to follow up with you later to give you this series of papers that was written not by my lab, but by a different lab that looked at cannabis smoke, nicotine smoke, and I think they compared to wildfire smoke, or maybe they did wildfire smoke, and in their paper they compare it to nicotine and cannabis smoke. There are some similarities, and in some ways it makes sense that this is all biomass smoke, so it makes sense that it would be that way. What we saw was that across the entire epigenome, we see this compression of methylation. So you have some gene locations that are supposed to be lowly methylated, and you have some that are supposed to be highly methylated. I don't have time to go into why. Just trust me that they're supposed to be bimodal, some high, some low, and almost none in between. And what we saw was a compression. So those that were really low got more methylated, and those that were really high got less methylated. And both of those scenarios are bad. And so we don't know exactly what it means yet, but the finding that it compresses that bimodal distribution is not a good sign.
All right, thanks, Luke. Alex W. has a question.
Hi, thank you. So we have this fire deficit on I guess most of our landscapes, and we've heard from others that the solution is to get out there and do like a lot more burning, like prescribed burning, cultural burning. But at some point, if we're doing all the burning that needs to be done, could all those intentional fires generate just as much smoke as we'd see from mega fires and kind of pose just as much of a health threat? Or is that smoke somehow different because the fires, I guess, are lower intensity?
I heard health in that, but I don't know if that's for me.
Steve, you want to take a stab at that one? Yeah, I think you're muted.
I'm unmuted now.
Okay.
Yeah, there are lots of responses one can make. The smokes we get from really intense wildfires and these monstrous smoke palls is more damaging than the lighter smoke that we tend to get from prescribed burns. And prescribed burns we can control. We can control within limits when we do it, what the dispersal rate is going to be, what the character can be. I think the fundamental argument is that the fires are going to happen and we're going to have smoke. And we can have it in these massive events, or we can have it in a semi-controlled event. And the semi-controlled event is going to be preferable. That still puts smoke in the air for people who are sensitive or vulnerable, and they're going to have to take measures for it. But I think we've lived for 50 or 60 years now because of the temporary success of fire suppression, removing a lot of smoke from the land, the removal of a lot of smoke from agricultural land, and clean air measures that have removed a lot of industrial smoke, that we've grown up in a world in which smoke is not common. And smoke used to be very common. It was a part of the seasonal thing, and people are now finding all kinds of ecological benefits from smoke. Not all smoke, depends on the right kind of smoke. And I've come to think that we may have to deal with smoke just as we do pollen or other irritants that are seasonally manifest. And I don't say that out of callousness. I don't see an alternative. The earth is built to burn, not all of it equally. We are going to have fires, and the real choice is what kind of fires, and within limits, what we want the character and timing of those fires to be, which is also to say what kind of smoke we want. The option of no smoke doesn't exist.
Thanks, Steve. Mike, do you have anything to add to that?
I just put some things in the chat that
Okay.
kind of address, and I agree with Steve.
Okay, thanks. And thanks, Steve. Grant.
Hey, I'm a journalist. I'm a freelancer in Portland, Oregon. Been living through a ton of wildfire smoke every summer, pretty much, although this summer was really good. Yeah, there's a huge equity aspect to this because access to clean air is so important. And I've heard of kind of different public health strategies to try and get people into spaces where there is clean air by way of shelters, or bring that clean air to them, right, with like subsidy programs or just straight direct grant programs for air filtration in homes. So maybe this is a question for Luke, like on that second strategy, which is actually paying for people to put filters in their homes. Is that like the best strategy that we have? Is it reasonable? Like, can we as a society afford that, or is that necessary? So those are some questions I had about that.
So I guess the short answer is, in our studies that we've done, so you can look up ARTIS, ARTIS. It was an indoor air quality study done at the University of Montana. It was with indoor burning, so it was with wood stoves, but it still applies. An indoor air purification system improved air quality by 60%, or lowered particulate matter by 60%, and improved asthma symptom days for asthmatic children between the ages of 6 and 17. So these air purifiers do work, but humans are humans. And even if you give them a fully functioning, great air purification unit, they will not always turn it on, and they will not always turn it on high. For example, they don't like that it's loud. Or they think it's going to take up a bunch of electricity, even when you tell them you'll pay them for it and you put a kilowatt meter on it and show them that it doesn't take up a lot of electricity. So there's just some natural barriers or inherent barriers to working with humans that I would say, if you were to look at, like, if we think about occupational health, there's like a pyramid of things that work and their impact. Personal protective equipment, which I would put air purifications in that bucket, is at the very bottom. We use it a lot. It's very cheap relative to these other strategies, but it's not as impactful because it takes the people engaging with it. At the very top is removing the exposure, and we're obviously not going to do that. So I don't know that there's an easy answer for you, and I don't know that there's an equitable answer for you, but this definitely brings up this idea of environmental justice, which we didn't talk about at all today.
Right.
Most people who are exposed to smoke are also exposed to other things. Like, just as an example, I would give, a migrant worker in Idaho. That person may have language barriers. They're probably not going to be able to advocate for themselves to get out of the field on a day that's smoky, and they may not even be able to, read signs or know that there are resources available to them. And then they're going to go home and maybe not have the best nutrition, maybe live in housing that's not the best housing, so on and so forth. They're going to be, the environmental impacts are compounding on those people. How to deal with that, I'm not 100% sure.
Thanks, that's helpful.
Thanks, Lou. Mike, did you have a visual aid that you picked up at the beginning of that question, or did I imagine that? You're unmute, or you're muted.
After almost 4 years, you'd think you'd get used to it. Yeah, I have air purifier. I have 4 of them in my house. We had a smoky summer. It's almost, I get people now who ask me, I have a job offer in Kamloops, but I don't want to come because of the smoke. Yeah. Thanks.
All right, thanks. Josh.
Hi, Mike. I'm with CBC News, not too far from you in Calgary. I think we've chatted on the phone a couple times. But I wanted to ask you about zombie fires, and we're hearing more about these fires that are burning over the winter in Canada, and then they come back the next season. I'm curious if we're seeing more of those and how that's impacting the wildfire season just broadly.
So zombie fires, as they've been coined by friends of mine, are fires that start during the fire season. They burn in peat. Peat is organic material that's 40 centimeters or more in depth. A sphagnum moss is an example of that you get at your landscape store. And you can have, like my picture showed, you can have snow on the surface underneath. The fire continues to smolder. And then spring comes, the snow melts, you get a nice, warm, dry, windy day, and the fire pops back to the surface. In our boreal situation, I've seen them survive over 1 winter. I've not seen them survive over 2 winters. Fort McMurray fire started May 1st, 2016, was declared out summer of 2017. A lot of the fires we're seeing this year will burn through winter into next year, but I doubt they'll burn through the next winter. Whereas peat fires in Indonesia Some have been burning 30 years and longer, and the health impacts from smoke are significant because it's prolonged exposure to smoke, because there's a season every year where they continue to burn. Are we going to see more of them? Absolutely. Does that now a lot of people are concerned that they'll come on in spring and cause problems, but fire management for fires of concern, they do the perimeter. So if it starts in the center, it's not going to go anywhere. It's not going to be a problem. But as we see more and more of these, wetlands are kind of like a conditional fuel break. That is, a landscape fire spreads, hits in these wetlands and stops unless you have drought, which then allows the fire to carry through. So it helps spread through the entire landscape. As we get to this warmer, drier world, those conditional fuels are going to be go fuels. They're just going to allow the fire to continue to spread. So we're going to see even larger and larger fires. We had lots of Donnie Creek's example. Many of these fires were, the size of Prince Edward Island or larger. We had 5 or 6 of them this year. We're going to see more and more of these as the landscape conductivity increases with drought and heat.
Thanks, Mike.
All right, thanks, Mike. Murphy, you have a question.
Yeah, I kind of wanted to ask like a 30,000 foot question. I think probably best for Steve, but I'd love to hear anyone's responses. I mean, this really feels like a very dynamic time in American wildfire policy. I feel like a lot of big questions are being asked and new directions are being charted. We have the Wildfire Commission report talking about a comprehensive change in American wildfire policy. So Steve, as one of the closest observers of American wildfire policy, I would kind of just like to hear your thoughts on like what the most significant or promising changes that you'd recommend in terms of how we manage fire. Like, what is the role of prescribed fire? What is the role of hardening communities and homes? I mean, just from your vantage, I'd love to hear your thoughts on the most meaningful policy reforms moving forward.
Well, there must have been several hundred proposed reforms in the Wildfire Commission report, which is, I mean, everybody had their say. Everybody's got something. Fire is pervasive when you start looking at it, and the things that it integrates and influence are pervasive. There are a few critical things we need to. Why are we having so many megafires started by power lines? I mean, that's a technical fix. We know the creaky grid needed. We've known for decades it needs to be replaced. So build fire into the reform of our power grid. And why are we transmitting it over these lines? So I think of fire as a driverless car. It's barreling down the road. It's integrating all these other things, which makes it very complicated and difficult to predict in all of its impacts. But it also means there are lots of points of contact. So a lot of the burnt communities, I think the evidence is really clear. You harden the communities against embers, and then against the possibility of urban conflagration following that. That is a very specific set of targets that could eliminate a huge problem. But we probably already need to do this. How about reforming, getting good fire into our landscapes? Well, we need to rehabilitate our wildlife habitat, our municipal watersheds. We need all kinds of ecological goods and services that fire is a part of. So we don't necessarily need $1 trillion program with 300 to-do items on it to solve fire. We need to put fire in with a lot of other things that we need to do anyway. And to reverse that, fire may be a catalyst to help push us towards a lot of reforms that we need anyway. So there is not a fire problem that we can address. There are hundreds of fire problems, and they can have lots of different solutions. We just need to recognize it and be willing. The problem with fire is that it's seen as episodic. It's something that happens in some places, not in others, sometimes not in others. It's not considered, the term was used systemic earlier. It's not considered systemically, and that's what we need. And if you do that, then you don't need a special fire czar to oversee all these things. We need fire to be part of the conversations of all these other things that are going on. And if we just isolate fire, then people look for a simple solution. Well, if we had more air tankers, we could bomb these things, back to the Pleistocene or whatever. Well, they fail. I mean, I love it that the Air Force Academy had to be evacuated about 10 years ago from a fire along the Colorado Front Range. I mean, why do you think that more technology is going to solve it? It isn't. We tried a 10 a.m. policy, all out suppression, beginning in 1935. It failed. It failed here. It's failed everywhere. One of the most interesting and helpful reforms that's going on in the Western U.S. Are managed wildfires, where a fire is in a sense innocent until proven guilty. I don't necessarily quote me as quoting someone else on that, but they want to put their resources where it really matters. Let's protect the communities as best we can. Let's protect the sequoia groves, the municipal watersheds, those high value assets. The rest of it, let's back off a ridge or two and systematically burn out. And this may take several weeks to burn out. If you do it, you're doing that as a prescribed fire, done under urgent conditions. You're not doing it as an emergency backfire where you just blackline this thing, you napalm it, and you've destroyed this area so it stops the fire, but you've done all kinds of other damage. And some regions are getting very sophisticated with this, and they're really quite clever. But that also, there are always trade-offs. If you do that, that means you're going to have smoke in the air for a long time, and someone seems to be taking their time. So I like the sort of box and burn strategy where they draw the box, they say this is where it's going to be, and that also means we can say how long we're going to be at it. So we can begin to manage the smoke as well. But basically, we've created conditions that are unmanageable in any rational sense. And we've got to work with the stuff that's available to us. And right now in the West, wildfire is doing the job. And the question for places like California is, how do you rebuild a better landscape out of what's been burned with these giant fires? You've changed the landscape in a significant way. How do we now build fire into the restoration or renewal or recreation of these landscapes? Those are the kinds of questions, I think. I'm sorry, you got me going on here.
I wanted to get you going. Thank you very much.
All right. Well, your timing is perfect. Steve, I'm sorry. Did you want to add something, Mike?
Yeah, what many people don't realize is a fire enters a community through a rain of burning embers. And sometimes these embers can be carried by the wind 2 kilometers or more, which means fire-wise, fire-smart principles are really hard to enforce. So the McDougall fire in British Columbia jumped across Lake Okanagan, at least 2.5 kilometers, maybe more. And to my knowledge, the fires never jumped across that lake. It's just too wide. But now, it was quite an active fire. We're seeing more and more of this. And that's a real challenge to manage the landscape that large. Thanks.
All right. Well, we have hit our time. I would like to give the 3 of you, Steve, Mike, and Luke, your day back. But we certainly appreciate you being here and giving us all this really great information. It's just a ton to think about. And I'm sure you'll all hear from these folks moving forward. So thank you all. We're going to give you the patented IJNR golf clap that serves as our first sign of appreciation in a Zoom meeting.